The man's name is Steven, and he's a gourmet. Today, he returned to his hometown in Michigan, USA. It's the prime time for summer fishing. Steven wanted to relive some childhood memories. He took a canoe and set off. This river leads to Lake Michigan, passing through vibrant green wetlands. He chose a spot to go ashore, planning to use it as a campsite. He took out his fishing bow and made some adjustments. Then, he chopped down a sapling, taking it with him. To bow fish, you need a visual lock on the target, utilizing the sun's reflection. The pole he had just cut now came into use. He rowed, keeping a close watch on the water surface. Unfortunately, after searching around, he didn't find any fish. It might be too hot, and the fish were likely resting. Since dusk is when fish are most active, he decided to head back to the spot he came from to set up his tent. Once he finished, he took out 2 lamps, intending to mount them on either side of the boat. He chopped 2 logs, tied them across the boat, and then fixed the lamps to the wood. Steven checked the setup. He was very satisfied with the setup. There was still an hour until dark. Steven patiently waited for night to fall. In the silent wilderness, a bright light suddenly came on. The boat was drifting with the current, with a man standing on it, holding a weapon, his eyes sharp. He was staring intently at the water surface, but unexpectedly saw a wild duck. Normally, Steven wouldn't mind improving his meal, but today, his mission was too important to let anything distract him. He felt completely in the zone, and his focus paid off. There was a fish in the river. Steven decisively shot an arrow, but it missed. He hadn't used this weapon in a long time and felt somewhat unfamiliar with it. Steven took a moment to reflect on his experience. Inspired, the moment he saw a fish, he struck decisively again. This time, he successfully hit a fish. As he pulled it up, the fish was still struggling. Seeing this, Steven got even more excited. He had recaptured his childhood feeling. The light attracted big fish to come closer. As long as Steven aimed well, he could shoot arrows. At close range, he could be very accurate. After a struggle, the big fish finally tired out. Just as Steven was about to pull it out, the fish made a sudden flip and escaped from the restraint. This annoyed Steven greatly. After catching the previous fish, he had forgotten to tighten the arrowhead. Learning from this lesson, Steven continued fishing. This time, he proved himself again by shooting an arrow through a big fish's head. Steven chuckled. Fishing like this was too much fun. He started to enjoy it. The next fish was another local species, called the butterfly fin. It had a spot on its tail and an incredibly ugly head, looking like a bullfrog's head was attached to it. Now that fishing was almost done, Steven returned to camp and began scaling the fish. He planned to cut the fish into slices, sprinkle some salt on them to prevent them from spoiling during the warm night, and then store them in a box. The night passed without incident. The next day, the sun was shining, and smoke was wafting around. Steven was preparing breakfast. He took out the fish slices and sniffed them to make sure they hadn't spoiled, then rinsed them with river water. He put them in a basin of fresh water to dilute the salt. Otherwise, the fish would be too salty. He then collected some branches and built a grill. Steven placed the fish slices on it, waited a moment, then flipped them over. Feeling the timing was just right, he tore off a piece to taste. The fish was very tender, tasting similar to smoked fish. Delicious things need to be savored. Steven ate leisurely. Having eaten a lot of meat usually, he was somewhat tired of it, and the grilled fish was lighter. Steven felt really good. He saved the rest of the fish for a snack later. He floated downstream, hoping to try his luck with a fishing rod and line. Once he arrived at the spot, he started fishing. The bait was a model of a small fish, swimming back and forth in the water. The boat kept drifting with the current until a fish took the bait. A fish bit soon after. Steven jumped directly into the water and pulled the big fish over. Wild fish are full of energy, struggling fiercely until the very end. This fish brought good luck. Steven felt like he had opened up his energy channels. He quickly caught a second fish, but after comparing their sizes, he realized the second fish was not yet mature, so he released it back into the water. Stephen continued rowing, enjoying the birdsong and the fragrance of flowers, cleansing his heavy spirit. As he moved forward, more and more modern buildings came into view. He was entering the civilized world. He chose to land on an island opposite a resort. When night fell, Stephen started fishing again. He saw a sharp-looking fish and speared it with an arrow, securing his first catch of the evening. Then he continued hunting, catching an even bigger fish. This fish had a mouth full of sharp spikes, and its scales were as hard as armor. But its flesh was very tasty. Now Stephen could head back. The next day, he started making breakfast. Using pliers, he peeled off the strange fish's skin, then avoided the thick armor to remove the tender meat inside. He sliced it, coated it with breadcrumbs, and fried it in a pan. The delicious fried fish fillets were crispy on the outside and tender inside, filled with a mouth-watering aroma that made one linger and forget to return. After enjoying his meal, he paddled his boat, admiring the beautiful Lake Michigan. This is Stephen's favorite way of life. He is a top predator and a gourmet, venturing into various dangerous situations just to get fresh ingredients and turn them into delicious dishes. The man is named Stephen. This time, he came to the northeastern area of New Mexico with his buddy Cody, ready to chase antelope. As soon as they arrived, Stephen spotted an antelope about 2 miles away. The two grabbed their weapons and set off. Antelopes are the second fastest land animals on Earth, second only to cheetahs. They also have incredible vision, spotting predators from a long distance, so hunting antelope is no easy task. And opportunities often come just once. So before they got close to the antelope, they loaded their rifles. It was mating season for the antelope, and the males were busy on the plains looking for females. Love can cloud the mind, and even if they see humans, they might still approach to try mating. Now, in front of the two, was a male in heat, but it sensed something was off, so it stood still. It didn't move for a while. After a moment, reason overcame impulse, and it chose to flee. They missed a good opportunity. Just as they were about to give up, the antelope suddenly stopped on a hillside. It seemed it hadn't given up entirely, wanting to check if the two humans in front of it were female. However, after a discussion, they decided to go deeper and look for a new target. After all, this antelope was already on alert. After some searching, they found another male antelope. Cody took aim, and just as the antelope stopped, the angle was perfect. He shot decisively. The antelope fell at the sound. They waited on the spot for a while before checking the game. Cody is a traditional hunter. After each hunt, he prays earnestly, thanking the animal for its sacrifice and hoping its spirit can return to nature. Now it's 3 in the afternoon, and the weather is unbearably hot. To prevent the innards from rotting, they decided to butcher the antelope right there, cooling the meat down quickly. Then they packed it by category. Each carried a backpack and started the return journey. Cody's father, Harold, is skilled at making a delicacy, red chili antelope cornbread. Stephen was really looking forward to it. When the two arrived at the farm, Harold had been waiting for a while. After some greetings, they started the preparations. He cut the loin into even chunks, then heated oil in a pan and fried the meat chunks till brown. Next, he added some flour and chili powder, made from a local type of chili, spicy and aromatic. After stirring everything evenly, he added a basin of water and simmered it on low heat for half an hour. During this time, he made some cornbread. As the sun set, dinner was ready. They placed the meat chunks on the cornbread, added some fries, then onions and lettuce, and red chili. Finally, they poured some gravy over it. A delicious dish was ready. Stephen couldn't wait to taste it. The flavor was spectacular. The aroma of the cornbread, paired with the tenderness of the antelope meat and enhanced by the chili, elevated the overall taste instantly. They had a pleasant evening. The next morning, the two set off again. This time it was Stephen's turn to hunt. As the sun rose, visibility increased, and antelope were everywhere. Their task now was to find a suitable target. Soon, a lucky one appeared in their line of sight. It was a male antelope. its mature presence commanding. Stephen locked on the target and started to approach the antelope slowly. Unaware of the danger, the antelope hadn't noticed him. Stephen hid behind a rock outcrop, secretly observing his target. Once he was sure everything was clear, he crawled through the barbed wire. He got closer on foot and hands. Just as an opportunity arose, Stephen suddenly stopped. He had spotted a row of houses in the distance, and he couldn't just shoot recklessly, risking hitting a person. So, Stephen had to head back. They continued searching for another antelope. Around noon, they spotted another male antelope. But then, unexpectedly, a herd of cattle appeared on the other side of the highland. Though this affected their shooting, it also created a cover for them to get closer to the antelope. Using this cover, they successfully got within shooting range, and as the cattle moved away, it was time for Stephen to act alone. To avoid startling the wildlife, he crawled forward. The antelope seemed to be asleep, oblivious to the danger. Stephen adjusted his rifle, getting himself ready. After taking a deep breath, he pulled the trigger. The antelope was downed with one shot. After the gunshot, peace returned to the wilderness. Only the antelope lying on the ground proved that a killing had just occurred here. Stephen touched the prey before him, marveling at its beauty. After admiring it, he began to process the antelope. Cody went to bring the pickup over. They packed the antelope into bags, then loaded it onto the truck and drove off. Tonight's dinner was going to be antelope with roasted peppers and cheese. Stephen cut the tender meat into slices, then flattened it by pounding with the flat side of an axe. He then took out a bunch of seasonings, added them to the meat, and fried it in oil. Once the meat turned brown, he added peppers, then cheese, and covered the pan to simmer for a few minutes. Now the meal was ready to eat. This dish was about finesse, handled like a steak. He took a bite, and it tasted really good. It was a very enjoyable hunt. The man hunted an antelope, butchered it, and brought it back to the farm. Then, he made antelope cornbread and had a hearty meal. The man's name is Stephen, a gourmet, but some people question his cooking skills. So in this episode, he was ready to show off his culinary expertise. First, he needed to sharpen his chef's knife a bit more, as it's crucial for breaking down animal joints and bones. Now, Stephen held a deer's thigh, which was still intact due to precise cutting angles, helpful for keeping the deer meat fresh. Today's first dish was roasted deer leg. Since the shank contains tendons and connective tissue, it needs a long cooking time to soften. So the best approach was to score it first, breaking down its structure. Then, Stephen took out a hacksaw and sawed the bones shorter. These bones would be used later. He tied them up with rope, making them easier to pull later. He then turned on the stove, took out some bear fat, scooped a spoonful, and let it melt in the pan. In the meantime, he seasoned the leg bone with salt and pepper, coated it in flour, and then fried it in the oil. The inspiration for this dish comes from blending different cultures. In Spain, they have a similar preparation, and a friend of his from Italy also makes a similar dish. After browning the meat, he took it all out of the pan. Then he chopped onions and garlic into dices and fried them in oil. He also prepared other side dishes, like celery and carrots, which are key for adding flavor. He added sage and thyme to the mix. Once the veggies were cooked, he placed the leg meat back on top, then poured in some tomato juice and added some water. Finally, he put everything into the oven. Now he was dealing with the deer thigh. This is fennel powder, great for removing the gamey taste of deer meat. He prepared a quarter cup of salt, a few tablespoons of brown sugar and fennel powder, and some chopped thyme. These mustard seeds are black pepper, hyssop, and juniper. He heated them in a cast iron pot, then crushed them into a powder. Finally, he poured them into a mixing dish. Then he took the deer leg out of the oven, almost done, but he still checked it carefully to see if there were any hairs or impurities on it. Stephen then took out some olive oil to create a sticky surface on the deer meat. He applied the seasonings he just prepared, pounding them in to infuse the flavors. He didn't miss a single spot. The next step was to make a roasting bed. He laid out onions, garlic, and fennel leaves in the cast iron pot, poured some olive oil, then placed the meat on top and put it back in the oven. The next dish was sheep eggs, meant to be cooked gently in butter to preserve their original flavor. Unfortunately, he didn't get the strength right, and the sheep eggs burst. Luckily, it wasn't a big issue. Stephen sliced it thinly and took a taste. The sheep eggs were chewy and had a very rich flavor. Then he began preparing the next dish. He once dined with an elderly lady at an expensive restaurant in San Francisco, where he had a dish made from bone marrow that left a deep impression. Today, he was trying to recreate that dish. He took 2 deer thighs, sawed them into small bone pieces with a hacksaw, and stood them upright, uncooked, in the oven, anticipating their transformation. Now all the dishes were in the oven, and he had plenty of time to prepare some side dishes. These were ground cornmeal, poured into water to cook a pot of cornmeal porridge. Once it cooled, he put the thick porridge into a plastic bag, rolled it into an oval shape, waited for it to solidify, then cut it into several thick cakes with a kitchen knife, and finally fried them in oil. By now, the time was about right. He took out the deer thigh to test its doneness, feeling it was just right. He removed the meat pieces, poured a bottle of red wine into the vegetables below, and continued to heat it. Once it boiled, he then extracted the juice. He was ready to drizzle it over the meat, enhancing the deer's flavor even further. Meanwhile, the bone marrow was also ready, each piece looking crystal clear, perfectly timed. Then he inserted herbs into them to boost the dish's visual appeal. Next, Stephen checked on another dish. The tomato deer bone soup was also ready. After a busy half-day, all the dishes were served. Not only flavorful and aromatic, but also unique. Stephen sliced the thigh meat thinly. Meanwhile, his friends and family started arriving. Stephen presented each dish to them. He loved sharing his culinary creations, and even more, watching others enjoy them. And these folks didn't disappoint him. Everyone started devouring the food eagerly. This was definitely the tastiest food they had ever tried. Everyone generously praised Stephen, calling him an outstanding gourmet. He is a man feared even by the animal kingdom, always returning with a bounty when he sets out. His name is Stephen, a full-time hunter and a gourmet. Today, he came to New Mexico, ready to chase Coues deer. Accompanying him was his buddy Remy, who loves pushing limits. This time, he planned to hunt using archery, a daunting challenge, because Coues deer are timid creatures with sharp instincts, easily sensing danger. However, the timing was in their favor for hunting, as it was mating season for the deer. These normally shy deer suddenly became restless and less alert. From a high vantage point, they soon spotted a deer, though it was a bit far. The two decided to split up. Remy crossed the canyon and climbed the opposite slope, rubbing 2 antlers together to attract a buck. Stephen stayed put, continuing to scan the canyon. Soon, he spotted another buck. It's usually hard to spot deer while hunting, but today, deer were everywhere. Stephen got even more excited. He was determined to find a big, healthy buck. On the other side, Remy, with his bow and arrow ready, started to make his move. He needed to get within shooting range to ensure a clean kill. Right in front of him was a very beautiful buck. To lure it in, Remy began to perform. He mimicked the deer's call while watching its every move, trying to get closer to the target. Unfortunately, as night fell, both were unsuccessful. When Stephen returned, Remy had already started a campfire. They shared their experiences, then spent the night there. The next morning, they set off on their hunting journey again. Remy just reached a hillside and saw a buck below, about 350 yards away. With plenty of time, he didn't want to rush. He waited for the perfect opportunity. As a top hunter, patience is an essential quality. Meanwhile, Stephen was still searching for deer. It wasn't until noon that he spotted one. The target was on the ridge opposite him. But just as Stephen looked over, the deer vanished from sight. So, he decided to go over there to investigate. To avoid startling the animal as he got closer, Stephen chose to crawl forward. His persistence paid off. and he finally saw the deer. Actually, 2 does. While he hadn't seen any bucks yet, where there are does, bucks are often not far behind. So, he just needed to wait patiently. His judgment was right. In the bushes not far away, there indeed was a buck. Stephen slowly raised his rifle. The buck, realizing too late, suddenly looked in his direction. In that quick moment, Stephen pulled the trigger. With the sound of the gunshot, the buck fell, kicking up dust. Stephen watched, stunned. He needed a moment to calm his excited heart. When he approached, he found the deer was so beautiful. Coues deer are relatively small, so they look quite cute. Stephen dragged the deer to an open area, skinned its belly, removed its organs, and then hung it up on a tree. He continued to skin it. After that, he began to dismember the body. Next came the part he was most looking forward to. He sliced onions, prepared some garlic and dried chilies, then heated oil in a pan. He tossed these veggies in, stir-fried them for a bit, then took out a venison steak, broke it with an axe, and threw the pieces into the hot oil. Once they changed color, he added the veggies back in, sprinkled some seasonings, poured in some water, and covered the pot to simmer for a few hours. To keep it warm, he buried it in sand. Meanwhile, Remy was still waiting for an opportunity. A deer just happened to pass below the hill. He grabbed his backpack and chased after it. When he reached the spot, the deer curiously looked at him. They stared at each other, creating a slightly awkward scene. The deer broke the silence, and Remy immediately aimed. Unfortunately, the deer hopped away. Remy never found the right opportunity, which he deeply regretted. It was no longer suitable for hunting today, so he started his return journey. As night fell, Stephen dug up the sand, pulled out the iron pot, and checked it. What he saw was a pot full of something very dark, almost like something from a cooking show about disasters. But at least it was cooked. The two tasted it. The ribs were tender and surprisingly delicious. They heartily enjoyed their meal. The next morning, they set off on their journey again. Today was mainly for Remy to complete his hunt. Stephen pointed him to the areas where the deer were active, then let him go alone, to increase his chances of success. He also prepared a secret weapon, a deer skin, which he draped over a branch. Then he stood in the open, waiting for a buck to fall into his trap. Remy kept fiddling with the antlers, making a clacking sound to simulate a buck fight, and occasionally mimicked the call of a buck to attract nearby ones. Soon, a deer appeared. It charged towards the decoy. Remy thought his chance had come, but the deer didn't show up close and ran off in the opposite direction. Now, Remy was both thirsty and tired. This way of hunting was too hard. He started doubting himself. If he came here again, he would definitely bring a rifle. After a wry smile, he finally faced reality and headed back to camp defeated. But on the way, something unexpected happened. He stumbled upon a deer, right in the nearby bushes. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Remy quietly took aim, and the deer still didn't react. Remy decisively shot his arrow. In pain, the deer quickly ran off. Remy couldn't hide his excitement as he went to collect his game. It was a young adult buck. Remy had finally proved himself. The man hunted a deer, skinned it completely, then dismembered it. He made a delicious bone soup with the ribs and had a hearty meal. The man's name is Stephen. He is a full-time hunter and a gourmet. Today he came to California, teaming up with his buddy Hank. Hank is a chef who learned to hunt in his later years, thus living a life of a culinary hunter. He and Stephen share similar interests, making them close despite the age difference. They arrived at a farm owned by a friend of Stephen's, populated with black-tailed deer, wild pigs, and various small game. The first thing they did was set up their tents. Then they embarked on their journey. They went to a highland to observe from above. The area was full of wild pigs, but they hadn't seen any black-tailed deer yet. After a thorough search, they finally spotted 4 deer, including a buck, which really boosted their spirits. But according to local laws, hunting big game on the day of arrival was not allowed. So, they marked the location and planned to return the next day for hunting. With plenty of time left today, they decided to hunt some small animals, both to pass the time and satisfy their appetites. The two went their separate ways, each searching for game. Hank casually picked a cherry and tasted it. It was really sour. Soon he saw a rabbit and took a shot at it, but missed. Hank used a smile to mask his embarrassment. He wasn't quite in the zone yet. Before long, another rabbit appeared. Hank fired 2 shots and finally hit the target. But it wasn't dead yet, so Hank took another shot to end its miserable life completely. This rabbit was of a moderate size, perfect for a delicious lunch. Though many say wild rabbit meat is very tough, but with Hank's cooking skills, he's known for making dishes with animals most people overlook. Wild rabbit is one of his specialties. Now with food secured, the two headed back up the mountain to continue watching for deer and wild pigs, especially bucks. They marked everyone they spotted, preparing for tomorrow's hunt. As daylight faded, they ended their observation. The night passed quietly. Early the next morning, they were back on the hillside, waiting for the deer to appear. Soon, a buck came into view. They confirmed its direction and immediately gave chase. They crossed over hills and came to a rocky area, right where the bucks were active. Hank hid there, waiting for his chance, while Steven stepped back, letting his friend have the opportunity. Unexpectedly, Steven spotted another buck about a mile away. Energized, Steven took action. He crossed steep slopes and thick bushes, approaching the target from upwind. He caught the buck off guard. Seeing the hunter so close, the buck didn't react in time. Steven immediately fired, but missed due to his excitement. The deer, clearly confused, forgot to run. For a top hunter, missing twice isn't an option. His second shot hit solidly. After a struggle, the buck finally fell. Hank, hearing the shot, felt envious, knowing Steven had succeeded. Steven approached the black-tailed deer, pleased with its healthy size. Due to the heat, Steven dragged the deer to a shaded area, while Hank was still waiting for his chance. Unfortunately, the deer he was waiting for didn't show. As Hank grew anxious, Steven began skinning the deer and sorting the meat. Then it was time for lunch. Hank was ready to make his signature dish with the wild rabbit caught yesterday. He stir-fried it with onions until the meat turned brown, then added garlic and prickly ash fruits, a great spice. He also threw in a bit of saffron, some leaves, and 2 chilies, then let it simmer on low heat. An hour later, Hank lifted the pot lid and poured in some wine made from grapes in his own backyard, enhancing the broth's flavor. Steven couldn't wait to taste it. The broth was delicious, the meat tender and flavorful, truly memorable. After a hearty meal, they set off again, this time aiming to bag some wild boar. Though the area was crawling with wild pigs, known for their cunning, hunting them was challenging. They split up. Hank crossed a stream to the opposite ridge, while Steven checked out the oak woods in the valley. Soon, he spotted a sow with a group of piglets. The wind direction was against him, so he didn't make a move. Instead, he just waited quietly. And soon enough, an opportunity presented itself. A wild boar actually passed right in front of him. Steven quickly fired his gun. Unfortunately, the first shot missed. The wild boar turned and ran, fast as the wind. Steven couldn't find a chance to shoot again, but he wasn't ready to give up and quickly chased after it. Unexpectedly, the wild boar was already down on the ground. It seems the first shot did hit the target, but the adrenaline had driven it to run here. Just then, Steven noticed another wild boar running towards him from a distance. So, he raised his gun and faced it. The boar only sensed the danger when it got closer, and then sprinted faster. But it was too late, and Steven shot it cleanly. He managed a double kill. In stark contrast to his situation was Hank, who hadn't even seen a single pig hair. Hearing the continuous gunshots, he was really feeling envious. Steven dragged the wild boars to a shady spot, removed their organs, and then met up with Hank. They drove the truck over, and together, they brought the wild boars back to camp. Now, it was Hank's turn to shine. Though he was disappointed not to have hunted any wild boar, cooking was also a big interest of his. The first ingredient was deer meat. Hank started by cutting the meat into pieces and frying them in oil. Once they changed color, he took them out, then poured homemade wine into cooked onions and soaked the meat in it. He added various spices, including chili, sage, and leaves, etc., and let it simmer on low heat. Then, Hank took out a pig heart, scored it following the lines, and flattened them. He then coated them in acorn flour, fried them in oil until one side browned, then flipped them over. Delicious aromas wafted around. It looked as appealing as it smelled. Meanwhile, Hank made a simple sauce with morel mushrooms and onions and placed it over the pig heart. Now the food was ready to eat. Stephen tried it and found it incredibly delicious. And the deer meat soup was also ready. They both heartily enjoyed their meal.